Welcome to Onward On-Air. I'm your host, Jake Soberal. As we begin today's show, it feels like there's a lot of crisis still out in front of us, but it also feels really important to begin thinking about not just how we reopen, but how we rebuild in a different and more equitable way. And for that, we're going to turn to two people that I admire deeply. First, Jacqueline Novogratz, the CEO of Acumen. Jacqueline's perspective is decidedly macro, thinking about the way that we can deploy dollars differently across the global economy to achieve different outcomes. And for the second portion of the show, we're going to dig in with my dear friend Irma Olguin, the co-founder and co-CEO of Bitwise Industries. And if you don't know, Bitwise is actually a portfolio company of Acumen. And so the work that you'll hear Jacqueline talk about at a macro level is expressed at a micro level by Bitwise. And in our conversation with Irma, we'll attempt to draw out what it's like to lead a company of 200 people in this different and challenging moment. I really enjoyed these conversations and think you will too. Let's get started. Delighted to welcome to the show today, Jacqueline Novogratz, the founder and CEO of Acumen. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hey, Jake. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. And worth noting here at the top that I and Bitwise am a direct beneficiary of the amazing work that you all do at Acumen. You all invested in the Series A, and I know I haven't shared this directly with you, but Acumen, when we first began, Bitwise, there was no horizon of we're going to go and raise a bunch of money one day. It was really we wanted to solve the problem that felt very near to our feet, and that was creating opportunity in our city and connecting it to people who needed it most. But there was something that blipped up on our radar, a company that you guys had invested in, and I thought to myself, if we ever were to raise money, I would want to raise it from an entity like that. And what you do at Acumen is really atypical. You guys have built an extraordinary model that makes investments that others don't in places and people that others don't. Would you say a little bit about how you got to that, and how would you describe the actionable thesis of Acumen?
Well, thanks, Jake. And Bitwise is such a great example, and it's a company that we could not be prouder of through Acumen America. And congratulations, I mean, a $27 million Series A is quite something. And to see the kinds of companies that Acumen America is supporting, and again, Bitwise being such an amazing prototype of entrepreneurs that take seriously, not just making money, but more importantly, solving problems, and then finding the right capital and talent to actually solve those problems in ways that create jobs and create a stronger America. And so how did Acumen get going in that way? You know, I had worked on Wall Street as a young pup, first job out of university, mostly in Latin America during a debt crisis. So another financial crisis in the early 1980s, where I saw the power of markets to enable innovation and job creation. I also saw their peril and how they excluded and sometimes exploited low-income people especially. That sent me on a journey that landed me in Central Africa, in Rwanda, at the ripe old age of 25, where I helped a small group of Rwandan women create the first microfinance bank. And there I saw, again, the power of access to markets as a form of freedom, if you will, and yet the need to accompany people so that they can actually make use of those markets, which, again, Bitwise really stands apart in doing. And that gave me the idea, as I saw that, and I juxtaposed that with top-down approaches to government and aid that too often left low-income people dependent and still excluded. I got the idea that what if we saw capital as capital? Money as a tool rather than the end in and of itself. What if we raised it, we raised philanthropy, and we made long-term, I'm talking 10 to 15-year equity investments in intrepid entrepreneurs like Irma and others, so that they could experiment, fail, learn what it actually takes to build and extend market opportunities to people who've been left out. And if we did that, and if we accompanied those companies with the right kind of talent, as well as using our social capital to connect them to other resources, maybe we would see both our own money raise and bring in other money, and real role models and business models for what's possible. And so we started in East Africa and India. We expanded to Pakistan, then West Africa, then Latin America, and then for the last 5-6 years, the United States. We've invested about $140 million like that in turn has enabled our companies to raise another 800 plus million, and served about 300 million low-income people across the world. So it works. It's
amazing. And the story is of course impressive, and it is impactful. And I remember the piece of it that was so alluring to me was how specifically you guys focused on job creation within the portfolio as a metric of growth, not just bottom line and returns and the like. But the thing that is sort of underlying that story is you all raise money from some of the most successful people on the planet. Many of those people made their money on Wall Street in ways that would not be categorized as impact investing. And you're up against the venture firms of the world that are promising these gigantic returns, but you're raising dollars behind this thesis from that category of actor. And I know some of them, and they're deeply supportive of your work. How did you craft that? And there had to be challenges and stories in saying, I want to do venture philanthropy, and you're not going to get a return, but you should do it anyway, and here's why.
Well, so look, how we do it now is a lot different from the pitch 19 years ago. What I realize now with more humility, although it doesn't sound like full humility, is that when we were starting, I knew what didn't work. And it was pretty irrefutable even then that we had 1.5 billion people with no electricity, 2.5 billion people with no toilets, 1.5 billion people with no clean water. And so I knew that didn't work. I knew there was power in the investment thesis, but all you had to do was look around and see who was getting the capital, where was it going, and where were the companies that were actually serving the poor. So at the beginning, I thought everybody was really excited by this model, even though 30 out of 31 people would say, Jacqueline, you don't understand how business works. I make my money here, I give it away there. There was this extraordinary group of early adopters, Jake, that told me only later that they didn't fully understand the model, but they were betting on the entrepreneur. They had seen that I had tried things. I had built Acumen, was the fourth organization that I built, that there was great logic in what I was saying. But as I look back, the pitch of give me philanthropy, I'm going to invest it in for-profit companies across the world for 10 to 15 years. Some might fail. And if they succeed, they're going to really succeed. And when the money comes back, we're going to reinvest in other companies that serve the poor. That's a really hard pitch.
Right.
And most philanthropists would say, it doesn't feel good, Jacqueline. I could use that same money to put kids in school or buy glasses for the blind. For the sight impaired. And I would say, yes. And next year, you're going to have to do it again and again and again. Now, 7-8 years in, then I was able to say, remember that $600,000 we put into the long-lasting malaria bed nets to create the first manufacturing capacity in Africa as a way of fighting malaria? Well, now they have 10,000 employees and they're creating 30 million bed nets every year. Suddenly, it was a different proposition. The next phase was then why aren't you a for-profit? I was like, well, first of all, that was a really hard company.
Yeah.
Second of all, our big success stories are not 40x returns. And again, you have to remember that this is over a very long period of time. And so this is about how do we put capital to the best use possible in a world where we are at such an extreme level of inequality that the wealthy should be looking at their excess capital in a much more ecumenical way. and giving the right kind of capital to those entrepreneurs who in the early day don't have access to the kind of R&D and friends and families networks that many people that are operating in traditional spaces for more well-heeled markets get access to.
Yeah, I remember in the early days of Bitwise, I went to Irma. Irma's actually slightly more experienced as an entrepreneur than I am, and much better at it. But in the early days, we were looking at something, and I realized that we could, as a company, one day we could make $1 million in a single year. That was a possibility, and it just sort of blew my mind. And growing up in this company, and growing up in the context of our city, a poor city in Fresno, California, did not begin this journey believing that there were mountains of money to be had. And one thing that has proven to be true time and time again, there's no shortage of dollars in this community, in this state, in this country, in this world. But it's the way that we use them that feels backwards. And I think that your description of them as just another resource in the mix is so right. What Acumen began doing was certainly as an outlier. You weren't joined by peers that were thinking of money in this way. And then I even think of in the impact investing space what Mitch and Frida Kapor have done, or what any number of impact investors around the country have done. The Lumina Foundation comes to mind. They're all extraordinary things. They all have now 10 and 20 years of track record. My curiosity is, do you feel like we're actually moving the needle on the not on the specific issues and companies that we're investing in that category, but on the way that we as a society view dollars? And with some perspective behind you, I'm super interested to know where your thinking lands on that.
Well, Jake, I might have had a very different conversation with you 6 months ago. You would be blind right now if we looked at the world of business as usual, where we allowed money, power, and fame to be sitting at the center of all of our systems, given that the end result of that in the midst of a pandemic is the exposure of the gaping wounds of that system, where capitalism unbridled has been an extraordinary mechanism for human freedom across the world. And it has created such extreme levels of inequality that in the midst of a pandemic, we see no social safety net for our healthcare. We see disproportionate impact on low-income people and people of color specifically. We see the interdependency of education, criminal justice, health, all broken systems. And so I would say now there's actually a very live conversation around what is the purpose of money? What is the purpose of an economy? What is the purpose of business? And so I'm finding, even in the last 3-4 months, Jake, much more curiosity about how we actually go from a shareholder model to a stakeholder model. And I find that deeply hopeful. But this is our moment.
I think it is. I mean, and say more about that. Like the world falling apart and systems as we understand them and have relied on them for so long, breaking, do create an opportunity. How do you see that?
I see it everywhere. What we're already seeing with the coronavirus and the pandemic is an acceleration of things that were on their way, but at the margins. And so prior to the pandemic, even the Business Roundtable had made a statement saying, we want to go to stakeholders from shareholders alone. And I'm a real believer that narrative can drive strategy, but you still have to break open the status quo. Suddenly, status quo broken. And what I'm seeing with the Acumen community of entrepreneurs and 750 fellows is enormous creativity and what I would call the moral imagination, looking at what you guys are doing around recognizing that it's time to think about workforce development differently, real estate and distressed assets differently, so that we can actually recreate as we're moving and not just put a Band-Aid during an emergency, but actually think about the future. You look at every table, which is 8 affordable, nutritious, healthy fast food restaurants, and how Sam Polk, another Acumen America entrepreneur, just pivoted day one of pandemic, sends a message out to the community. Our purpose, not our profits, our purpose is to deliver healthy, nutritious food. If you can pay, great, we'll deliver it to you. If you can't, let us know. We'll deliver it to you anyway. If you can pay it forward, here's a link. And so literally we watched this model shift from a pure private sector play to private-public philanthropist, individual citizen play, to a point now where they're about to have, I think they're soon to cross 1.5 million meals delivered, a significant expansion of jobs for people that need jobs in the midst of this. That's the kind of moral imagination that is business-oriented, recognizing it needs to be financially sustainable, but purpose-driven and aimed at the future. And in Pakistan, where there has been no health safety net whatsoever, again, I'm seeing young, typically entrepreneurs that have businesses that were trying to get tech platforms into the kind of common consciousness. But for rural poor people, it's really hard to go from not having a doctor anywhere to at least then you can get to a clinic where there's a health worker. But now, because all the clinics were shut down, there's been this movement to online consultations, which has allowed for Sarah Khurram, the entrepreneur, to then reach out not only to doctors across Pakistan, but across the diaspora. So suddenly you've got doctors in New Zealand and the United States providing consultations to low-income rural women in the far-flung areas of their country. To me, that unlocks what the world could be in the future. We cannot let that momentum go, because there will be forces that will pull back into business as usual because it's more comfortable. But I get to work with a community of people that, for whatever reason, likes to be uncomfortable.
It's a phenomenal community of companies and individuals. And I am curious, you work with those individuals, you're surrounded by them constantly, you support them, you are a sought-after speaker, you've written the textbook in many business schools, but you are also a human being living through this moment. And you've touched on the fact that we're amidst a pandemic, amongst several other things. I'm curious how you are doing and where you're at in this. I find myself in Fresno now. We're up over 100-degree days, and we've got 3 little kids at home, and the fatigue is setting in. The fatigue of this sort of like never-ending day almost, and there is a sadness to the world around us that alternates with what you know as an investor in Bitwise of this. Okay, now let's do something about it, and that's my experience. I wonder where you're at amidst this and what your sort of emotional journey staying put at home has been.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you also for bringing the human part of the 3 kids at home and the heat and the loss. I'm so aware of what people are going through around all across the United States, and also in all of the countries outside the United States. When the pandemic hit on day one, we made a commitment to raise emergency funds, both in the United States and globally. It really gave us a deep view into the realities of this moment. And in places like India and Nigeria, Kenya, Pakistan, where there is no health safety net, the loss of a $2-3 a day job plus lockdown literally meant starvation. And so I guess holding that as a human being, it has been a source of great humility for me, anger, but also because I'm so privileged, I don't have children in the house. I have air conditioning. It's also just reignited this sense of urgency. And in some ways, Jake, I was born for a crisis. And I think about what it has taken to build Acumen, plus having built an institution in Rwanda that then endured a genocide, and watching people there who literally picked up pieces of paper off the ground, even though half our leadership team was lost, and put this bank back together again. I've actually seen communities and countries go from decimation to being, Rwanda, one of the strongest countries on the continent of Africa. And so I veer back and forth. I do these poems every Sunday. To your point, not my poems. I post a poem every Sunday. And I was thinking about this Sunday, and I'm feeling in the zeitgeist and in all the conversations that I'm having, a real sense in people that the uncertainty is also really wearing them down, that all around us, while there's a breaking open in Black Lives Matter, is creating a deeper, new conversation that should have been had a very, very long time ago, but at least is happening now. So are we seeing greater divisiveness, greater division, greater fear of each other in many places. Announcements of school closings, schools not opening, and the exhaustion that is giving to parents. You can feel that in us. And in my own background, that's also a very dangerous time. It's a time when demagogues can prey on our insecurities, make us blame each other, and sometimes do terrible things. And so I feel this sense of a deep urgency that this is then therefore our moment to be the countervailing voice, force, and role model.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that moment a little bit, because there is perhaps no better voice to think differently and creatively outside of the structures that have prevailed to this point about how we deploy capital against this set of problems in the days that come. And certainly there are a lot of very important answers to that question, but what are those that you're most tightly focused on? And if we even narrowed the lens here in the United States, if you had a magic wand and were able to point capital in a handful of critical directions, what are those that you're thinking the most about, and where would you focus?
Well, where Acumen America does focus is on healthcare, workforce development, which is what you all do, and financial inclusion. They are the three fully interconnected. And so we are doubling down in all three areas, which are also real models for where you see the intersection of race, poverty, and exclusion. And so this is a moment as well for looking at the different financial instruments that we have at our disposal. And this pandemic has taught us that if you invest in character, which is what Acumen has really learned how to do. By that I mean find the entrepreneur and her team, understand who they are, which is why we're so proud of Bitwise. Back them. In a time of emergency, don't go through business as usual to take 6 months to do an equity investment. There is a role for grants to get through the emergency. There is a role for guarantee funds and for concessionary debt funds. Help particularly those entrepreneurs who have a way to get through and a vision of what should be in the future, and accompany them. And so I do have examples from around the world, but on my mind is right kind of capital, right kind of character. And that is a conversation that we should be having, because at the end of the day, all of our sectors, systems are fully entangled and interdependent. We will not solve our healthcare unless we also solve criminal justice, unless we solve education, unless we solve food systems. And so how do we go to where we, whoever you are, as an investor, as a philanthropist, as a government agency, what you do best, but then develop the skills to focus on the problem, not with ideology, but with what it will take to actually solve it. And then partner with a lot more humility in terms of knowing what you bring to the table and what you decidedly do not.
Yeah, and you're right. That is the Acumen thesis, particularly the Acumen America thesis, the day before the pandemic, and have observed that continued to be the case, and powerfully so amidst the pandemic. We've partnered directly, in addition to our core work, on Onward US, the platform that is designed to help workers find a way back to work and also the resources they need along the way. And so Acumen stepped up quickly and powerfully in that moment, and has been a really, really impactful platform.
But you led. No, seriously, this is so important. This is what character-based investing looks like. You led, we could meet you so that you could help us see what the future could be. And that's what we need to tell these stories. This is where the storytellers have a real role to play in the midst of this pandemic.
Absolutely, and I think there's something to be said for leading from behind. There's so much that you all do that is done with a real, authentic humility that empowers folks like Irma and myself. I want to talk a little bit about you. You wrote a book that you intended to go on a massive tour and share out. One of your tour stops is going to be here in Fresno. We were delighted to host you, and then a pandemic hit. Of course, the book is Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. If you would share a bit in your words about the book. And then I'd love to hear the best laid plans, what it's like to be ready to go out on a book tour and then just sort of be stuck at home doing all of this remotely.
The book was written, I wrote the book initially to think about what have I learned in 20 years of running Acumen about how do you build businesses and change systems that serve the poor. The more I thought about it, what I realized is that we need more than a systems shift. We need a mind shift. And that mind shift had to be a complete rethinking, because we know that our institutions have run their course, but we don't know with what to replace them. And so the idea of moral revolution is not some magic set of rules prescribed from on high, but it's the courage and the grit to navigate between many different belief systems. But decidedly and importantly, move away from systems that put money, power, and fame at the center and instead insist on our shared humanity and the sustainability of the earth. That was the beginning, Jake. And what has been fascinating was the timing couldn't have been worse, and it couldn't have been better. Couldn't have been worse because suddenly you have a 14-city book tour that's gone. No media will cover you because of the pandemic. Right. There are no bookstores. It's really hard to even move books. So that was and nobody can gather. Right. Besides that, it was really amazing.
Everything's
On the other hand, look at the conversation we're having. Mm-hmm. When you just look at workforce development and what does it mean to build jobs, this moment in our history has exposed that we have been allowing, all of us, an economy that undervalues, underdignifies people who do extraordinary essential work. And we call them all essential workers now, but they are still underpaid, undervalued, and we cannot let that continue after the pandemic. We need a new conversation. There's a way with the idea of moral revolution is to turn it upside down. Start by identifying not only the problem that you want to solve, but in the way that you want to solve it, so that your definition of success ultimately requires you to be financially sustainable, no doubt, but insists on including the poor and vulnerable, not just how the wealthy fare. And I am finding a huge level of openness to that conversation. And because we don't just speak in theory nor pretty words, because we can point to examples like Bitwise, like the Acumen America companies, like D-Light, which now has brought solar, light, and electricity to 100 million low-income people, that we can point to the grit and the resilience and the focus that it takes to shift systems. And again, not in ways that are small, but actually that if you give them time and you get the right kind of capital at the right time to them and support it, you truly can help build nations. And that's what this country needs now more than ever.
Yeah, and you mentioned storytelling earlier, and I think that is so important. The companies in the Acumen portfolio, whether abroad or here in America, are all doing extraordinary things. But it occurs to me that this is a moment in which it's difficult for those things to find oxygen in the conversation. I mean, we struggle to get beyond certainly the very important story of COVID, the story, adjectives reserved of Trump, the story that is very important of our economy and its perhaps fundamental collapse. How do we get these things space in the conversation and the exposure that they need in a very, very crowded conversation?
I think that's one of the critical conversations, Jake, that there is one, I think we capitalize on this moment, that a very live conversation is, where's the capital that are going to minority entrepreneurs? Number one. Well, you and I both know that they exist. They are extraordinary. Irma is one of them. When you come from community and understand community, you are more likely to understand how to solve the problems with and for community. And so 60% of our portfolio are people of color, 40% are women. And so without self-promoting, because this is not about any one of us, this is about all of us. Where can we find those friends in media that will raise these enormous opportunities and role models for how we might make change and allow people to speak in their own voices? I think it means that we also have to get better at the way we tell stories, that so often we tell them in ways that are exciting to ourselves, but not necessarily exciting to the audience. But now the audience is all of us in America, all of us in the world. We're looking for solutions. And so I think there's a huge opportunity, and it's really on my mind, about how do we lift up these stories in ways that lift others up? Because we also need examples of speaking across left and right, speaking across ideology. Because I also think that we are having a really hard time finding ourselves in each other. And yet, when you just take America for a moment, not the rest of the world, even though America needs a new humility and not, and being part of the rest of the world, this is a country that was founded on an idea. And yes, there are lots of broken parts of what it meant to build to where we are and our own brokenness today. It still stands for something, but it's to all of us to renew what it wanted to stand for, however imperfectly. This is that moment. And the thing about entrepreneurs who are purpose-driven, not ideological in their way of being, is that if you need to work with government, they'll work with government. If you see that it's really just about the private sector, okay, they'll just do private sector. There are so many examples. And again, I look to what you all are doing at Bitwise. It's not saying, oh, these poor people are victims and we need to help them. Nor is it saying, hey guys, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. I did it. It's saying we need to build a system in which all of us have a chance to participate. And that's not just about providing opportunity. That's also about accompanying people so that they can have they build their own capability to take advantage of these opportunities. And that's why this is going to take all of us. It's a different story, but it's a story of entrepreneurship. It's a story of individual responsibility. It's a story of belonging. It's a story of wholeness that encompasses the extraordinary diversity that has always been a part of this country. And that's what I think the big story is. And that's why the entrepreneurs that we get to know are so inspiring to me. And it's a story that's not been told in a way that sits right at the heart of the best parts of America.
I think it's so important, and sensitive to time, I want to ask one last question, and that is, where do you see us in this the story arc of this, multiple set of chaotic moments? We've got a pandemic, we've got an economic recession at least, we've got racial tensions, but as they are unfolding, do you think that we've got worse yet to come before we start to rebuild? Do you see us in a moment of rebuilding already? And what is your outlook?
I think because of my 35 years of seeing some of the really ugly moments of our human history up close and personal, I feel keenly aware that we are sitting at a moment of unprecedented peril and infinite possibility. And so the peril comes from continuing down a track of divisiveness. And the possibility comes from taking this moment of breaking open and redesigning our systems truly in a way that puts our shared humanity at the center of them. We're ready for it. We want it. And this whole next generation is demanding it. And so that's where my hope sits. It's a hard-edged hope. It's not an easy, blind optimism. But it's a hard-edged hope that is based in human possibility, the recognition that we are the system. So it is to us to remake the system. But it means that moral revolution idea has to go beyond the entrepreneurs, or even the companies, or even nations. It has to come back to each and every one of us. How we vote. Are we voting for moral leaders that are putting low-income people at the center rather than overlooking or exploiting? Are we showing up to each other in ways that are full of respect? Are we taking care of our neighbors? Are we insisting that we get away from this us and them, or ideology around I'm a nationalist, I'm a globalist? This moment in history is asking us to be a little bit more strategic and pragmatic, that we will only solve the coronavirus globally. We will not solve it by fighting like scared dogs, nation by nation for our own vaccine. Because even if we vaccinate everybody, the game ain't over until everyone has it. There's almost something that nature is saying to us. There are problems to be solved globally, but they must be rooted locally. So this for me is a time to remind ourselves, every one of us, that it is in the difficult times that we have the chance to find our best selves, that how we behave now, how we show up now will define who we are in the future. And I try to remind myself, and this goes back to your question about where we each are, that discomfort is a proxy for progress. And so when it feels really hard, really uncomfortable, ask what that discomfort is teaching us, and stretch into it, and therefore out of it.
Yeah. So, Jacqueline, I want to circle back on one question, and it is you've shared about the investment thesis of Acumen, and it is unique, and embedded in that is supporting entrepreneurs of color and women. And what are the strategies and experiences that you can share about how to both find and then empower those entrepreneurs that have been left out of opportunity for history?
One is to recognize that they are all over the place, and that it often comes down to finding networks of people who are connected to other entrepreneurs like themselves. My grandmother used to say, "Show me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you are." And if you look at Silicon Valley, so often well-intended people find people who look like them, speak like them, etc. And so early on at Acumen, we actually would hire what we would call circuit riders, who would get into communities that we might not have as much access to. Once you have a few, those entrepreneurs lead you to other entrepreneurs. And so I would say, first of all, there are many organizations like Acumen America, you mentioned the Kapoors, that are specifically working in solving problems of poverty in this country. And that's a good start point, because companies like Bitwise, like Consejo Sano in Los Angeles, that works as a platform for healthcare that is just extraordinary. MindRight, that is finding a way of dealing with the pandemic of depression and anxiety that young people have. These are companies that actually need more capital. And so let's build up some of our great opportunities as we also create networks of people who are looking for this kind of capital. Also take more bets on as angels that go beyond our family and friends network. I think it took me too long, Jake, to really understand the power of one's own social networks. And that was a big piece of Acumen's work, was to extend our social network to people who might not otherwise have that opportunity, because it's all there for us. And it's a much richer, much more powerful, and much more effective journey when you actually work with people who understand and know communities and can not only solve problems, but then can be role models.
It is so important that we underestimate the tool sort of box that we bring out of privilege to any problem, and what it must be like to not even be aware of the tool set. And I think that you guys have really powerfully extended the power of your network to those who have not known that sort of reach before. So,
Jake, let me just say thank you, and we're still learning. We all need to learn from each other.
I think that is an important and humble reminder. So I think that covered the last loose end. I'm so thankful that we got to visit, if even over video, and thankful to you and your team. Eamon and Eliza are amazing.
They're amazing.
Oh, they're so good. And one of the first investors that we met, we were introduced by a mutual friend, and they said, this is the smartest set of investors that I know. And this was like a Silicon Valley, Sand Hill Road investor that was praising Eamon and Eliza, and they're fantastic.
Well, they love you, and I was so depressed, and I want to do something with the book in Fresno with you guys, and really think about how do we start to tell these stories in different ways. I've never met Irma either in person, and but I've been reading up about you guys and talking to Catherine and Eamon. The work you do and the imagination of looking at distressed assets and the opportunity you have right now, because God knows what's going to happen to commercial real estate, right? That how do we think about what it actually means to revitalize places when we may not be going to work?
Yeah.
And what are the skills that are needed? And what I also love about you guys is it's not just upskilling, but it's also about dignity. It's also about career paths. And I think that those are which I wish I had said in this, but those are two real pieces that are missed when we talk about jobs or we talk about workforce. And it's a little like Acumen. At the beginning, some of our younger people thought it was so hard to do a deal and sexy that when the deal was done, we're like, and that's why we moved from, at one point I was like, I don't really want to hear post-investment ever again. We have an accompaniment model. So we literally use that language at Acumen of accompaniment.
Well, and we've lived the benefit of that. Eliza serves as an observer on our board, and Eamon is always extremely helpful as well. Well, we'd certainly love, when the lights come back on, to have you in Fresno. Let's hope for sooner than later. And if in the interim there are opportunities to do things, they're all screaming in my ear, let's do a virtual book event. If there are opportunities for us to collaborate, we would love to do that. And so we'll follow up. I've got some information to share out, our impact report and a handful of other things that I'll get over to you, and we'll follow up on maybe some next things that we might collaborate on.
Jake, would you send it to me directly? I'll read it all, I promise you. And ironically, we've been in Acumen, we've been in America 5 years, but I have spent, I think partially the team was early on, but I normally immerse in our companies. So I really I know the stories of the customers, et cetera. And I haven't done that. And yours would be a place that I'd love to know more. So I'll look at all that. And at one point we might just want to have another conversation where you guys really educate me, because I am doing more and more speaking. And we're in this together. We're all part of this now.
I think that is such an important word, Jacqueline. I thank you so much for making the time to join us and share your voice and heart, and for your work. It is both inspiring and I think important in its daring nature. And so thank you for making the time today.
Well, Jake, I thank you and for being a storyteller and for having these kinds of conversations. I thank you and Irma for the day-to-day work that allows you to be a gritty storyteller, because you know what it means to be on the ground. You know what it means to work with people who are striving to take care of their kids' health, to go to school, to know that their efforts have some corollary in terms of output that they can count on. And that for me, you guys are the heroes and the role models that we all need to be more like. So I thank you for this chance, and couldn't be prouder that Acumen works with Bitwise.
I so appreciate Jacqueline's voice and leadership in saying challenging things from the biggest of stages that call us to do things differently. But those ideas she's sharing are so important to rebuilding in a better way than we left behind before the pandemic. And you heard from Jacqueline that so much of the work of Acumen is expressed through its portfolio companies, and one of those is Bitwise Industries. So we thought this would be a good time to take a deeper dive into the work of Bitwise and introduce the show to Irma Olguin, my co-founder and co-CEO at Bitwise. The interview we wound up taping was quite long. If you know Irma and I, we enjoy laughing and telling stories. And so we've got a sliver of it that we'll share here, and we're going to release a longer form version of it as a bonus episode in the coming days. Let's get started with Irma. So We found Bitwise in 2013, and in 2013, Fresno. So Fresno, for context, is a city with a metro population over 1 million people. It is, I think, 30th, 31st largest city in the United States. It is a large, poor city. And in 2013, we were also in the pits of the Great Recession, as it was. Although we might have to alter great here, but unemployment was double digits. If I remember correctly, it was 16, 17% still here in Fresno, even while others had started to recover in other places. We had a housing market that was decimated, which is easy to think about in terms of that segment of the economy is not doing well. But literally, we all knew somebody who had lost their home. It was really, really bad. But we believed that was the exact right moment to do something like Bitwise. And fast forward 7 years, now Bitwise is in 4 California cities, and it feels like we have been able to have a profound and positive impact in those places. But it does feel like we are sort of living in Groundhog's Day, in that the world around us feels like that again. And I know for me, amidst this pandemic, and we'll come back in a moment to the health sides of it, but amidst this pandemic and this economic collapse and the racial inequities laid bare, I am alternating between like a deep sadness and lament for the world around me and its failures and hurts, and this like, all right, I need to put on my armor and we've got to go to battle. How are you experiencing that, and what specifically does it cause you to want to do next with Bitwise?
For the last part first, I think what to do next with Bitwise is, like, if we are in fact going to level up human beings that don't otherwise get invited to these pieces of the economy, to whether it's home ownership or the technology industry or 401ks, like, choose a thing. You fix it when it's broken, and it's broken. Like, it's broken right now. So I think this is an opportunity to take what is broken and to layer on the things that we know work from our experience in doing this for the last 7 years, so that we can change those outcomes the next time we climb out of this hole. And that feels super incredibly difficult, but also like, what else are we going to do with this time? We don't want to remake the world we were living in before. It was inequitable. It was unfair. It was, any number of things that bring me true heartache. I think that this is the moment where we get to say, that way didn't work. This works. We can do a lot more of it if we lean in. So pandemic, recession, economic collapse, like whatever it is that we're ultimately facing, there are a set of tools that we know can work, that we can use to dig ourselves out of this, and it's in such a way where everybody participates. That's what I think we ought to be doing with this time. In terms of how it's hitting on a personal level, I feel attacked. I feel angry. I am extraordinarily disappointed in leadership at all kinds of levels. There isn't a day, I don't think, that goes by. There's just an anecdote, I think, to highlight. There is, down the road from where I live, this street that used to be a pedestrian mall, and they, a couple of years ago, they tore it all up and they put a street there, and it has been empty. It's not been revitalized. It's not sort of coming back to life the way that we hoped it would. Now there's this pandemic, but pre-pandemic, even there started to be this gathering that would happen there every Sunday of folks who wanted to do like a car show. And it's not like a formal thing. It's just people show up with their cars and they cruise down this street, and other people sit on the sidewalks and they bring their own chairs and they watch this car show. And from the place that I'm from, the people that are there don't bother me, largely Spanish speaking or Latinx. And in my mind, they're just having a good time. This is a Sunday night. And I'm out walking the other day, and I noticed, and it didn't start out this way, but I noticed that there's a large police showing now at that gathering. And for the full 30, 45 minutes that I was out there, there was a helicopter circling just that street, just up and down that street. And for all I know, they're there for good reason. But I can tell you that the climate of today and the way that it feels like everything is just so incredibly twisted and feels very personal, it feels aggressive. Like the police force and the circling helicopter feels aggressive. And this thing that I understand to just be this gathering, that's, don't get me wrong, if you lived on the street, it would for sure be obnoxious. It's loud. But it just feels like it's aimed at people. And I think that is a really common theme lately, is that it feels so targeted and so aimed at people who, are not being given, in many cases, the benefit of the doubt. And you just see that there isn't a single day that goes by where I feel that, where I don't think to myself, we're not giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I don't even, you just become exhausted with that. Like I'm weary with the idea that we don't do that as people these days. And to be fair, neither am I giving that show of force the benefit of the doubt. They may be there for a good reason. I don't know, but I'm led to believe that they're not.
Yeah, and I think that we've talked a lot about the murder of George Floyd here on the show over the course of the last couple of weeks. We visited with Olin Douglas from Motley Fool, who you know well. We visited with DJ Kreiner from St. Rest Baptist Church, who you know also. Both, Olin shared this story of he needing to talk to his kids about the game plan if his sons, now young adults, about the game plan for if they got pulled over before he talked to them about sex. And DJ talked about the sadness in his community and the varying responses. I'm really specifically interested in hearing you talk about experiencing from the Latinx community, how you have experienced, how you have lived these last several months in Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, and before that too many others. How you relate, how it feels different, how it feels like you're directly involved in that community, and how you feel a little bit separate, how you feel like the experiences might be separate between the Black and Brown communities.
Well, I think they're definitely separate, and I don't think it's fair for the Latinx community or the LGBTQ community, which I am a part, to pretend as though the struggle is exactly the same, because it's for sure not. I do feel attention. I feel targeted. I worry for my personal safety in a way that I never have before. And I can't say with any authority that one specific group has it worse than another group. I'm not willing to say that either, but I do think that they're very specific, very different, and just like full of fear. There was the Black Lives Matter. A lot of the protests were taking place during the month of June. June is also historically Pride Month. That's usually a time of Jubilee. And that didn't happen. And you feel a sense of solidarity, honestly. I do, at least. And, being in the queer community and saying, keep the month of June, and let's actually talk about Juneteenth, and let's actually look at ways to be supportive of the Black community. I think that we need to be supportive in that way and have that sense of solidarity without trying to overly identify with the struggle, because I think it reminds me actually a lot of grief, after a death of somebody that God forbid you have a family member who dies. It is the most insensitive thing to me for me to say, oh yeah, my uncle also died. It's like, that's not what you need to hear from me right now, right then, and so there's a time for me to grieve, there's a time for you to grieve, and we can do that in solidarity with one another, but we don't have to make our experiences the same in order to know that the other person is hurting. And that's really, for me, what it really comes down to is how about some recognition that these folks are hurting? And how about taking that seriously in a way that doesn't make it about you? That feels really important to me. I might be faced with all of these different things and all of these different communities that I belong to, but it's still not going to be the same as, say, the Asian American community, especially in the days of the coronavirus, and or the Black community in the days of the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and on and on. I have my own. I hope that people stand in solidarity with me. I hope they feel a sense of support, but I don't need you or anyone else to make it yours.
Yeah, and our position, I think it's really well said. Our position at Bitwise, by virtue of our team first, and then by virtue of our ambition and heart second, we wind up connected personally to so many of these issues that are not based on our specific experience, walking in that sadness with others and walking through that process with others has felt delicate, and like I want so badly for you to know that I'm hurting, that I'm hurting for you and with you, and that I see you hurting, but we don't have a playbook for any one of these things by themselves, or for all of them together, much less. And so that's felt particularly challenging and heavy, I think, at least from my seat. One of the things that, and you know that this is where my mind races, that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, is that whether it is the murder of George Floyd or the inequities of our economy that are exposed even further in a dramatic, profound, abrupt recession that's being caused by our poor reaction to the pandemic, these aren't outcomes that happened on accident. We design systems to specifically cause these outcomes, and that becomes relevant to this conversation here, I think, because we will often have a conversation about Bitwise and say we think there are these three pieces to an ecosystem that can create a more equitable and generative economy in underdog cities, as we call them. And people will often say, like, that's complicated. That's so many. There's so many things going on, and we'll say it's three things. Do you think about the journey for a white man from privilege that has to, like, think about they've got to maybe get a scholarship in sports or academics, and then they've got to choose between these colleges, and they pick a major. They're going to take several classes related to what they are interested in, several classes related to what they are not interested. Maybe they go to grad school, maybe they don't. Maybe they enlist in the Peace Corps. Like, the journey to becoming a software developer for somebody coming from privilege is exponentially more complex than the journey that we're proposing for folks from communities of color and systemic poverty. And it's met with this reaction, though, this new idea, this reaction of that's too complex. And I think it betrays this underbelly of we don't want it to be different. And that is something that truth is something that we've sat with a lot. And I would love to hear you talk about how you stay motivated in the face of that, in a really, really challenging moment.
Well, first of all, we see that everywhere. We see that, every time we attempt to do something new, we're met with that answer. This is complicated, or that sounds really hard, or wouldn't it be easier to get rich a different way? And 100% it would be easier to get rich about 25 different ways, none of which we're currently doing. But I think that that's not the point. How do you stay motivated? What else would I do with my time? Mm-hmm. My life. What else would I do with my life but this? It feels, if the story that I told at the beginning is true, where I landed in the seat by accident, and I get to enjoy the fruit of all of those accidents sort of combined. And sure, yes, there's hard work woven in there. I'm not denying that. But if I get to enjoy that fruit, who am I if I don't share that with other people? Like, who am I if I don't figure out a way to give other folks that same feeling of choice and agency or power that I get to enjoy every time I make a decision to have a pizza delivered? Like, these are not, at the different levels of opportunity, you have to have somebody who's reaching back to pull more people into that level. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen any other way, right? And that's why we're constantly looking to leadership at all levels of government and business to do something different, because that's how you're going to change it, is by those folks pulling other people along with them. That's the responsibility that I have as a human being. That's the responsibility that you and I share as leaders of our business. And hopefully whatever is beyond this, to be able to do that more and more often. I think we have to normalize that. That is not something that feels obvious or common to people who typically make headlines, that they are dragging other people with them or giving folks behind them that same opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that intentionality is easy to miss, but I appreciate the way that you act as that conscience in our organization. I want to zoom in tightly on the pandemic, and there are lots of facets to the pandemic, but one specifically is how we as a company, and you talked about our responsibility to our people, we as a company, we view ourselves as directly, certainly maybe responsible, at least influential, but and certainly like in love with the 200 people that make up our team, and the supporting them is new and different. How have you, I think, come to that, and how is it different than it was in February?
I think the thing that is loudest is re-understanding my job. It's probably the most difficult part of for me in my life. Is relatively simple, was made even more simple, honestly, by the pandemic. I was traveling all the time before, and now I get to be home and sleep in my bed, and drink my own coffee and not rely on the hotel Keurig or whatever. So my life was simplified. Everyone else's became, it feels like, infinitely more complicated. But in reflection on that, like understanding how to support those same people and help them feel good at something is an entirely new set of facts to sort of pretend to know every day. We were giving employer reviews. I was giving an employer review recently, and I said to the person, your work is phenomenal, but all of the things around your work that I'm now much more aware of, do those become a factor in the way that we talk about this now? Do we talk about whether it's distractions with children or home life or your internet connection, how much of that gets woven now into what we think of as work and your productivity and whether or not you're good at it? And how does that change my expectations of how I want you to produce and what it looks like for you to be good at that? I don't think that we have gotten anywhere near the bottom of that question. I think that the pandemic and the work from home / shelter in place, I think we're going to do that on and off for a long time. And we're going to really need to figure out what we expect from parents, what it looks like for children to learn in this period of time. Like tracking with grade level learning, I think really needs to become a thing of the past, at least for a period of time. But that traces all the way into your job and what we expect your work week to look like, or what we expect performance to look like. And I don't think that we're anywhere near the bottom of that. I think what is happening right now, and I think it's detrimental to society as a whole, as folks are trying to take the 40-hour work week that existed before and move it to Zoom. Mm-hmm. And that's a really great way to cause a lot of mental and emotional damage, if you ask me. I don't think anybody feels like this is close to what they had before, and I don't think that anybody feels like this is as life-giving. Even this interview is not as life-giving as it would have been were we sitting in two chairs on the stage inside of one of our buildings. Right. That's everywhere. Every decision is layered with 6 additional things we're not even taking into account right now.
Yeah, it feels heavy. It feels more tiring. We spoke for the first part of today's episode to Jacqueline Novogratz, the CEO of Acumen, somebody that we know and admire. And Jacqueline hangs with the masters of the universe, the folks who have made Wall Street and many of the companies that are largest and most well known on the planet, but does really, really deeply thoughtful and impactful work. And I ask her, okay, so like, where are you looking for the solutions to what we're living through right now? What gives you hope? She, in a way that was humbling and terrifying, looked back and said, I'm looking at you guys. Like, I'm looking at Bitwise and so many of the other companies in their portfolio and similar portfolios. It feels to me like we are experiencing such deep failure at the federal government level, in so many of our state governments, in so many of our local governments, that it is up to us. So how does that leave you feeling as we think about enduring what is a continuing crisis and coming out of it, and what is it that you want to create on the other side of this, whenever that is?
I don't know if this is going to be surprising, but I feel like this is what I was made to do. Mm-hmm. I think the extraordinary failure at the federal level, it did not have to be this way. Like, if we had listened, whether to your better angels or to science or to experts, or like, the litany of folks we could have listened to, we'd be done by now. We'd be back to work. And there were ways to do that. There are ways to do that now. We could do things starting this month that put us all on a track to having relatively normal lives by Thanksgiving. That could happen. And I don't think that it takes an extraordinary mind necessarily to come up with what those things are. It means we have to abandon what we knew as normal and really solve for the problems that are real today. But if you get rid of all of the fluff that goes into the emotional cloud that is this moment, and you really if you can get rid of all of that and focus on what the actual problems are, there's solutions to those problems. And you could mobilize an effort to make this moment bearable so that we could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I feel made for that kind of work. I feel made for getting rid of that cloud and saying, what are the real things? And the execution of those things would be really hard, but the design of them would not be a Herculean lift. So I feel frustrated more than anything else. That we don't yet have the power and authority to move on those things, or the sort of federal level resources to move on those things. I feel frustrated by that. I think the hardest part of this moment, because I can't act on what feels true to who I am at this moment, is that there is no real light at the end of the tunnel. Like, we're literally waiting for a scientific breakthrough at this moment. Yeah. That's not a great position to be in. I think we do need to give scientists more time to work, but to just have to wait and see what happens next and who's going to make the wrong decision with, schools or and their reopening, or beaches, or local bars, to have to wait to watch that play out, create that light moves further and further away. Yeah. And so that fills me with a sense of frustration, not hopelessness, but frustration, and probably more frustration. I'm probably carrying more frustration in my body today than I ever have in my whole life, for the inability to make these decisions on other people's behalf. Yeah.
It does feel heavy, but it does feel like a call to action. And I think that folks have seen pretty clearly over the course of our conversation why it is that I tell my story first, and then you go second. Last question, it's a heavy one, Irma. If you were to have to choose from among my characteristics, handsome, funny, charming, you choose. Which is your favorite? Feel free to pick multiple.
You are funny. people don't know this about you, I don't think. And I don't think it's assumed about you either, especially on like first meeting, but you're actually really, really funny. It's just not always when you wanted to be funny, which is the best.
It feels like a backhanded compliment.
Yeah.
Irma Olguin, co-CEO, co-founder of Bitwise Industries, on every top 10 list in the world, it feels like right now. Thanks for taking a couple minutes to hang out with us.
It's been a good time. Thanks for having me.
In both Jacqueline and Irma, I see two individuals that have crafted for them a form of leadership and a path that is decidedly unconventional. And it has made them uniquely valuable to our world in this moment, and their voice uniquely important to this time. And as I reflect on where we're at in the world and what's next, these are two people who I'm looking to, whose leadership I'm following, who I look forward to rebuilding with. We're grateful for them spending time with us. We're grateful for you joining us. You can find this podcast at onwardonair.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you'll join us next time. Take care.